All right, let's get into our first conversation now, shall we? Farmers in the country have expressed concerns over large-scale destruction of produce, saying the damage caused by the flooding disaster could be estimated at over 30 billion naira. The flood in the country has now destroyed rice, maize, sorghum, millet, beans, groundnut, beans, and farms and hundreds of livestock. Now, only last year, a survey conducted in 7 states of the country showed that about 79% of Nigerian farmers were estimated to have been affected by the ravaging effects of drought and flooding in 2020. The analysis, also put together by an Africa-focused research firm, revealed that the harvest of 26.3% of Nigerian farmers were greatly affected by extreme weather conditions. Let's get to dissect some of this impact on flooding in the country on farmers. My guest is a fair friend of the house. He's a researcher and agribusiness economist, Dr. Matthew Ojo. He joins us live from the United Kingdom. As always, it's such a pleasure to speak with us, Dr. Ojo. When you take a look at the impacts, the dire consequences we are feeling at the moment, the devastating effects of flooding in the country, can I ask you, did you see this coming?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program, and also good afternoon to our viewers. Well, of course, for many people in the research sector, they would have envisaged this kind of thing happening, because in the light of global risk coming from climate change, where you have many countries making preparations and also planning ahead to be able to mitigate the effect of climate change, especially as it concerns food production. Nigeria is not at the forefront of doing that. Apart from the challenge of awareness, there's also the issue of committed effort, okay, both at the federal level and at the state level, to factor in the possible risk or effect of climate change when it comes to food production. Now, you just talked about flooding, and you've reeled out your statistics. It's not the first time we'll be having flooding in the country. We had one that was very devastating in 2012. We had another one, slight one, in 2019. And now this one that is reported to have led to over 600,000 deaths and displaced around 1.4 million households or houses. And also is also reported about, I think, 110,000 hectares. That's about 270 or thereabout acres of farmland are destroyed. So when you look at all this, one thing is glaring, and it's also the effect or the consequences of lack of proper planning when it comes to things like this. Now, how does all this affect food in a country like ours? You've already mentioned it. When you have about 70%, okay, of producers exposed to the risk of flooding, especially if their farmlands are located in flood prone areas, then you can just translate that to what that will mean. Flooding in the past has affected food security in the country, first in the area of food availability. Why? Because all the factors of production are affected by flood. Okay, the producer, that's the farmer, is affected. The land is affected, okay? The labor, those who probably work with him, are affected. The capital are also affected. So when that happens and farms are devastated by this, the entire factors of production that would have either to made food available are impacted negatively. And that's why there will be fears concerning food availability in the country, once you have this kind of a disaster coming. And then it also affects not just food availability, it affects accessibility. Accessibility in the terms of farmers who probably are not affected personally may not be able to access their farms physically, because maybe the roads leading to their farms or the bridges and all that would have been destroyed by flood. So it becomes physically impossible and impracticable for them to go to farm. So if they can't go to farm, you have food crops wasted there, and so many things they would have harvested probably will be spoiled on the farm. There's also the issue of economic access, of course, price. When you have these food crops not being available, for example, the yam you've mentioned, the cassava, the maize, and also maybe rice. When these food crops are affected, the prices at the market of course, will go up. And it then means that a country that is already battling with a food inflation of around 23.24% as at the last count, and you have a country that is already spending up to $10 billion on food importation annually. Now you can now just translate that to see what that will mean in terms of food prices, okay, in the coming months, and then how that will affect household. There's also the issue of food quality. All right, if you have food stored somewhere and flood comes in and soaks it up, farmers normally will try to see the much they can salvage and sell. That will affect the kind of quality of food you get at the market because they just have to survive. And then you also look at the issue of stability. How stable will the supply be in the light of all this that we're talking about? So it goes to tell us that we need to factor in some of these things. And when I'm talking, usually I like to be specific because this is not just a federal government issue. And unfortunately, we have a country where if you have such, this kind of disaster happening, you have governors of states throwing their hands up in the air and calling on federal government. And the question would be, okay, are there not things that can be done at the state level? Agreed, this is nature, but we can plan for it, okay? We can plan for it such that the effect it will have on our food production in particular will not be this disastrous, or it will not have this kind of impact on us nationally and also maybe sub-nationally. So these, I think, are the things that we need to start asking ourselves and how we can, going forward, find a way to address some of these things. Now, in terms of inflation already, people are struggling. Households are struggling. If you look at what food inflation was 10 years ago compared to what it is now, for example, in 2012, food inflation was just 9.9% in August, compared to what it was in August last month, this year,
in the month of September.
I'm even leaving out September, August to August, 10 years. It has risen by over around 134% in just 10 years. So it calls for concern, as I always say, but it also shows the lack of planning on our part as a nation.
Yes, and let me take you up on that, Dr. Joe, before we perhaps discuss other issues. If we're perhaps to avert this impact of flooding, what kind of actions perhaps would we have taken as a country, or authorities should have taken to prevent this? I mean, I know that in the agricultural sector, there's something called irrigation and all of that, but walk us through some of the modalities or some of the measures perhaps that we would have put in place to reduce the dire impact of what we are seeing play out across the country.
Of course, that's a very good question. The first thing is this. In our agricultural planning, all right, there's something that's called the plans that are drawn at the national level and at the state level. Efforts should first be made to factor in things like this, okay? So we don't just have plannings that assume, that leaves out the impact or possible effect of climate change on production. I was in a part of a team that was drawing the plan for development plan for Nigeria, I think 2 years or 3 years ago. And the entire, somebody brought a plan and they didn't factor properly climate change effect until somebody had to raise it and, to be looked at. So agricultural planning in Nigeria cannot be done without factoring these kind of issues. So you model your plan, you bring in, let's say that we have flooding. And from the report, we have 33 states affected out of 36. So you factor that in. If it happens and it affects the entire state, what do we do? What is the plan B for us? So this can be factored in at the point of planning nationally and then states, because I will not stop talking about states. Some states are so lazy when it comes to ideas and planning, and everybody waits for the federal government. That's one. Number two, each state can look at the state, their own state. They know areas that are prone to to flood, and areas that are not prone to flood. So in terms of planning, where people can go to because at times it's difficult for you to tell people leave your home and move to a place and stay there. It takes time. But we can have a plan B where your state, you have located areas that are least prone to flooding, and then create space for farming, create space for food production in those areas. Unfortunately, such areas are left for the rich and the mighty. But the rich and the mighty also need food. So that is one thing that we can do. Number 3 is this. We need to start thinking on how to, in the next 5 years, increase the capacity of our strategic food reserve in the country. I've mentioned this earlier. There can be no better time than this. Because if, I think I was reading somewhere that the president ordered that they should release around 12,000 metric tons of grains. The question is, what would that do in the midst of all this? But then, if we have planned that increment over the years, we probably would have stored or piled up enough that we'll be able to ameliorate the effect of this kind of disaster. So we need to also look at that, how to ensure that each state strategically has these reserves, and then they are in the areas where they cannot be easily affected by flood, and then we'll build up the storage over time. What I think we can also do, because farmers also need to start learning how to adapt to some of these things, okay? Apart from some of this flood caused by maybe dams and all that, continuous rain can also contribute. So how do farmers prepare for this? Okay, how do we prepare our farmers to, for all things like this, in terms of training them, in terms of teaching them adaptation practices, and how to prepare when they are also planning to go into production. So there are things, these are things that we can do to ameliorate or mitigate, against things like flooding that is almost becoming an annual phenomenon for us.
And I'm also wondering perhaps how this, Dr. Joe, how this is going to contribute to the level of inflation and food scarcity, food insecurity in the country, because the farmers have had to battle with insecurity. But just a month ago or so, a month ago plus, I was at the Mile 12 International Market here in Lagos, and the farmers told me, most of the farmers expressed their fears about the impact of flood, and not even issues around insecurity. So I'm wondering, with this emergence of the devastating impacts of flood, and as well as insecurity, which has prevented most farmers from accessing their farms over the years or in recent times, I wonder what exactly you would perhaps fear the most to happen in the coming months.
What I fear the most is the number of households that will further fall below, drop into poverty. Okay, so let's put it in perspective. I think, was it few days back or a few weeks back, the minister was talking about that we are only currently using about 44% of the agricultural land available in Nigeria. So if you look at that, just 44%, so 56% not yet used, we're having issues with food production. And then the issue of insecurity came in, that prevented or is still preventing some farmers to have access their farmlands. Then we have banditry, and we have now flood. So if it is just around 44% we've been able to use, who knows how many percentage has been reduced by the combination of all this? Maybe we are doing like sub 40 or maybe 30-something% in terms of using agricultural land, and that translates to you not being able to produce. Okay, so the whole thing has to do with the food has to be available first. When it is not available, then immediately it translates to higher price. The ones that are available are sold at a higher price. And when they are sold at a higher price, it becomes difficult for households to be able to afford some of these prices. So that is where the challenge is, where people are not able to eat and feed themselves. I mean, one thing that is common for both the rich and the poor is that they have to eat. So it doesn't cut out anybody. And it now becomes it gets to who has the money to buy what they need to eat. So some people are being disenfranchised economically because of non-availability of food. That is disturbing, because the easiest thing to translate or to get out of this will be crime. Okay, we've run research, and in our analysis we've seen that when you have people not being employed, gainfully employed, it easily translates into crime. And here you have farmers who hitherto had gone, had the opportunity of going to their farm and at least produce something for themselves. If they are not able to produce, they turn to something else. And food is not available, prices go high. My concern is I don't know, what food inflation will be in the coming months. Is already disturbing to me. Because if at 23.24% or 0.34%, people are crying, the government needs to urgently look at what can be done. And unfortunately, this is a year preceding elections. So you find people are not listening. Most people are concerned about electioneering campaigns and all that. But honestly speaking, Nigerians need to plan ahead, because with this flood disaster that we are grappling with the issue of insecurity, food availability for the coming years, it might be a challenge for the entire country. It will definitely be.
Yes, and I was just going to ask you, perhaps, what kind of a people are we? And if we do pay attention to information and warnings, for instance, whether on the path of government, and even the farmers themselves, does this perhaps tell about the kind of people that we are?
Yes, it does. I think my major problem with a country like ours, both those at the helms of affairs and those who are supposed to plan, is the utter disregard for data. Okay? Now, you have a government that is not willing easily to fund data collection. And when you have people presenting data to the government so that we can at least have that awareness to start planning, you find government officials coming out and spending hours or minutes trying to refute such data. What data does is to give you the awareness to pay attention in case you are not. It's not necessarily about rubbish in your government. But unfortunately, where you have people, independent organization telling you, okay, 79% of this is happening, 22% of this is, and attention is not done. So you see, we are a country that hardly use data for what it ought to be used for. We just hear and the news goes around and everybody keeps quiet. If we had been paying attention to both gathering of data and using data to inform decision making, I'm sure we'll be at a better place as a nation currently. But like I said, it's reported, some newspaper said over 110,000 hectares of land affected. Others are reporting lower. You really can't tell the exact, because no such data is readily available. And honestly, we might just be underestimating the impact that this flood, this current one, is going to have on food production in Nigeria. Food production, one, then the farmers themselves, the individuals who hitherto have been gainfully employed, become jobless. Their families become exposed to any kind of risk available to wherever they are kept, and I bet you after a few weeks or few months they forget them. Nobody even remembers that some farmers have been displaced. Nobody goes to them to find about their welfare. What plans do we have? If we have over 70% of the population into farming, and maybe majority of them are affected by flood, what plans do we have to ensure that, okay, when they are displaced from where they are and taken to somewhere, they can still continue to do something, a bit small? They can have small plot of land to maybe grow vegetables or grow maize, which will be ready in 3 months' time or thereabout, for feeding and also for income. Practically nothing, I bet you. So that is where I'm most concerned. That is what disturbs me. You have a nation that does not look ahead for its citizens. It becomes challenging. All right? They are farmers. All right. They produce the food we eat. We need to take care of them when they are faced by disaster or whatever you may want to call it, when they are challenged in ensuring that they produce.
Yeah. Well, these are indeed very interesting times to be a Nigerian and to be here. but just before perhaps I let you go, Dr. Ojo, I know we're discussing flood, but officially the Minister of Disaster and Humanitarian Affairs, Mrs. Sadiq Umaru Farouk has officially said that in the northern part of the country, we have now transitioned into the dry season. And so perhaps we would expect that the flooding would reduce across the country, but we also know the devastating impacts of what droughts as well, or droughting can cause any country. We know, of course, in Kenya, for instance, in Kenya, Ethiopia, how they have always had to battle with issues around drought. But what exactly would you describe as your recommendations for the government as we have, of course, headed for the dry season at this time?
Thank you very much for that question. I think a few years back, I was involved in a research project that looked at taking advantage of flooding, okay, to boost production. I think that research was funded by International Water Management Institute, if I can remember. What we did and what we found out, you see, when you have flood, especially areas where the river bank overflow is banked, and it has receded, because during flooding you also have, you know, a good part of the soil being washed to a particular place. We found that during that research, covering from Anambra to Kogi and I think Benue, yeah, those three states, farmers take advantage of the receding flood to quickly plant, okay? They plant, you know, vegetables because the soil is still moist and can easily produce for them. So in every disaster, we should look for the opportunities there, Jerry. And part of the opportunities is to, once we have settled the issue of farmers where they will be, because they probably are they're most probably displaced now, they can take advantage of the receding flood to quickly plant short crops that will be ready in the next 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. Then another thing we also need to look at to take advantage of is ensure that farmers are well educated on coping strategies, how to, you know, come back from this kind of thing, because psychologically, emotionally, many of them are already devastated. Of course, Nigeria doesn't pay attention to that. How do we bring them back to that state where they are willing to produce? We need to pay attention to that. So if we plan properly, if we take control and take care of those who are affected and help them to regain their stand back, I'm sure we can make the most of these disasters. And then for the future, plan to ensure that the effect is not as bad as we're currently experiencing in terms of food production.
Well, quite an interesting conversation, as always. Researcher and agribusiness economist Dr. Matthew Ojo, live for us in the United Kingdom. We'd like to thank you most kindly for speaking with us here on Business Nigeria.
Thank you very much for having me.